Today we will continue reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 16. The Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas, everyone said at once. Oompa Loompas? Imported directly from Loompaland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but... Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt, I am a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beast in the entire world. Hornswogglers and snozzwangers and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the Wangdoodles and the Hornswogglers and the Zoonwangers. And they were practically starving to death. They were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops, looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves and the bark of the bong-bong tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food that they longed more than any one thing was the cocoa bean, but they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cocoa beans a year, but oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cocoa beans all night, and they talked about them all day. You only had to mention the word cocoa to an Oompa Loompa, and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cocoa bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cocoa tree, happens to be the thing in which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cocoa bean. The cocoa bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of these beans every week in the factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy for this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa-ish. Look here, if you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cocoa beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cocoa beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaning from his chair. Of course I mean it. And you can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than the beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music, and they are always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, that they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deer skins. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. And the women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa, and I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa now. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy. Get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pet, her father said to her, we mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right, but I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see that you have one before the day is out. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you had better do that. Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river and was now kneeling on the riverbank, scooping hot melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Chapter 17. Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw that Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh, no, please, Augustus, please, I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus!" called out Mrs. Gloop. "Didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from the river at once." "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Oh, boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus!" cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus!" cried Mrs. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out of the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus! You'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," said Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." And Mr. Gloop was absolutely right. For suddenly there was a shriek and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop, "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help! Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I am doing something," who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer to the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the river bank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upwards, and sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it head first like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police! Augustus, come back at once. Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to get through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look, he's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once!" The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in the solid mass, pushing up against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus. Woof! He shot up again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does the pipe go to? Quick! Call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. Just wait and see." "How can he possibly come out of it just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds." "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, and absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask you?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because the pipe doesn't go to the marshmallow room. It doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make the most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate fudge?" "My poor Augustus, they'll be selling 'em by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up the pipe, you monster!" she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that by sucking my boy up into the fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke? He'll be perfectly safe, said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. He'll be chocolate fudge, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Never, cried Wonka. Of course he will. I wouldn't allow it, said Mr. Wonka. And why not? asked Mrs. Gloop. Because the taste would be terrible, said Wonka. Just imagine it. Augustus-flavored chocolate-coated Gloop. No one would buy it. They most certainly would, cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. I don't want to think about it, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Nor do I, said Mr. Wonka, but I do promise you, madame, that your darling boy is perfectly safe. If he's perfectly safe, then where is he? Lead me to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers. Sharply, click, click, click 3 times, and immediately an Oompa Loompa appeared as if from nowhere and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. Now listen to me, said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe. The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and exploded with peals of laughter. Oh, do be quiet, said Mr. Wonka. Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think it's at all funny. You can say that again, said Mrs. Gloop. Go straight to the fudge room, Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompas. And when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him in there. But you'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured out of the fudge boiler, and that really would be quite a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite unedible. Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. I'm joking, said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop. Goodbye, Mr. Gloop. Goodbye. I'll see you later. As Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried them away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon very small drums. Augustus Gloop! Augustus Gloop! Augustus Gloop! Grandpa! Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing? Shh, whispered Grandpa. I think they're going to sing us a song. Augustus Gloop, cried the Oompa Loompas. Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what do we do in cases such as this? We use the gentle touch, and carefully we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so unutterably vile, so greedy, foul, and infantile. He left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we choose a thing that, come what may, would take the nasty taste away. Come on, we cry, the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see, inside the room to which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear child, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed, although of course we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Slowly the wheels go round and round, the cogs begin to grind and pound. 100 knives to slice, 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 and add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away for once and all. Then out he comes, and now by grace a miracle has taken place. I told you they loved singing, cried Mr. Wonka. Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word that they said. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least I hope they're joking. Don't you?